Hello everyone. My final paper presentation. The topic is Jesus China Missions Revisit. Jesus China Mission Revisit. The thesis statement: the history of the missions of the Jesus in China, especially those of the Italian Jesus priest Matteo Ricci, provides valuable insight into Christian ministry in a postmodern and post-Christian culture, including immigrant culture of North America. So it's mainly about the history of the mission of Jesus in China in general, and the Italian Jesus priest Matteo Ricci in particular, and provides insights into Christian ministry in a postmodern and post-Christian culture in general, and the immigrant culture, including Chinese immigrant culture in North America in particular. So the first part, I will give you the biblical foundation. The opening lines of the founding documents of Jesus declares that the society was founded for whoever decides to serve as a soldier of God, to strive especially for the defense and propagation of the faith, and for the progress of souls in Christian life and doctrine and code. So Jesus sometimes refers to God's soldier, God's marine, or the company, which involve from reference to Ignatius, the founder of Jesus. Ignatius' history as a soldier, and then the society commitment to accepting orders anywhere, and then to induce any conditions. So according to these documents, I will give you the biblical foundation. The first biblical foundation is in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11 to 13. It's about God's soldier, God's marine. This is Ignatius' history and all his background as a soldier. This biblical verse, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11 to 13, is about the armor of God. So it provides the foundation of apologies in defense of Christian faith. And it is in relation to Richard's defense Christian faith against Buddhism and Taoism. And the second biblical verse I would like to provide to you is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23. This is in relation to the society commitment to accept orders anywhere. It provides an example of the strategies of cross-cultural mission employed by the Apostle Paul. The 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23, the Apostle Paul explains his strategies of cultural accommodation in cross-cultural mission as limiting a Christian's freedom to serve the kingdoms of God, so that he may be like the indigenous people according to the context of his Gentile ministry. So the third biblical verse I will give you is Genesis chapter 47, verse 7 to 10. It is in relation to the society's commitment to induce any conditions. Genesis chapter 47, verse 7 to 10 describes an interesting story of Jacob with the implications to immigrant theology of Christian mission. In these biblical words, Jacob, as a new immigrant in Egypt, was interviewed by Pharaoh. He describes his life ahead, his life abroad, because he's in Egypt, it's not in Canaan. It's life abroad as a pilgrimage. However, he blessed Pharaoh because he started not only of Israel's patriarch, but also of the father of the Egyptian prime minister, that is Jesuit. This blessing significance of Christian evangelism and social justice can be applied to mature retreat. Why? Like the patriarch Jacob, retreat could be considered to be an Italian immigrant minister in Ming dynasties of ancient China, because retreats arrived in China at the age of 30 in 1552, and he spent the rest of his life in China until he died in Beijing in 1610 at the age of 57. And he established the cathedrals of the Immaculate Conception in Beijing. This is the oldest Catholic church in the city of Beijing. So the second part I will give you presentation is the cultural accommodation. It's just according to the biblical words I just mentioned, is the 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23. It's in relation to retreats cultural accommodation principle. In this cultural accommodations part, I first give you the general principle. The overlap of Confucianism with Christianity in pursuit of moral excellencies to be an authentic gentleman. This combines with introductions of Western science, the pursuit of reasonings. These two, the moral excellence and Western science, or the authentic gentleman, or the pursuit of reasonings, both provides foundation for successful mission of the Jesuits in China, as well as the modernization of Chinese culture. I would quote a sentence written by Richard about it. This is his own words. Quote, "The Lord of God was in conformity with the natural light of reason, and which what their first sages taught in their books." So here mentions the light, the natural light of reason, is emphasize reason, and then the first sage pursue, the first sage talk in their books, that is become an authentic gentleman, the moral excellencies. So this is the general principle. The second is the methods of modo suo. Its Latin word means gentle and sweet methods. This is Nietzsche's plans to convert the Chinese people. He adopted this kind of gentle and sweet method to deal with his host culture. That is, the missionaries should learn the language, the culture, and the native ways of life of the countries in which they work in order to adapt to its customs and respect its tradition, and that it contradicts to Christian's morality, which was generously known as cultural accommodation. And the second part of his cultural accommodation is cultural exchange in respect and in dignity. Richard and his fellow Jesus were able to reassure their scholars and officials who followed Jesus that they indeed treat Chinese friends as equal, and that the Christian message they brought was respectful of China's old culture and national dignity. On the other hand, Richard was also benefit from the welcoming and the questions of his friends like Qi Guangqi and their passions in revealing to Richard's Chinese ways of thought and cultural treasures. This is a very interesting interaction. The interaction between a friendly Renaissance scholar and the earliest Confucius scholar. These two scholars' interaction is a fascinating chapter in the history of science, cultural, and spiritual exchange. And the third part of the cultural accommodations is the dialogue strategies. The book of The True Meaning of the Law of Heaven is Richard's book, is not considered to be a typical catechism in the forms of short questions followed by short answers that are to be memorized by the new Christians. Rather, it is a work to attract readers to the reception of Christianity. Richard wrote it as a dialogue between a Confucian scholar and a sage from the East. It is the first attempt by a Christian scholars to introduce Christianity to Chinese intellectuals by using Chinese ways of thinking. Many of the statements found in The True Meaning of the Laws of Heaven have familiar patterns as analectic of Confucian, these classic books of Confucianism. Underneath the statement hidden the Chinese traditions, values that is overlapped with Christianity. Richard's approach to non-Christians resembles in many ways of the earliest Christian church. The theological tradition of the church father, such as Clement of Alexandria, who brought the heritage of Homer and Plato to the service of Christian thought, as well as today's emergency church movement, ECM movement, in the postmodern and post-Christian age, because the emergent church movement emphasizes conversation and dialogue. This is what Richard focuses on. The fourth part is about PLR methodology. Richard applies the distinction between catechisms, especially catechism I have mentioned, and doctrines. This distinction between catechism and Christian doctrine to his preaching ministry. He adopted indirect preaching and direct preaching according to whether his audience was rare elite or the new believers. If it is rare elite, he will use the indirect preaching. If it is new believers in Christ, he will use direct preaching. I will expound this more in the last part of my application. The third part of my presentation is the internal motivation and personal relationship. This tool is related to individualism and self-identity in the postmodern and post-Christian age. First, is language. Richard's appreciation of Chinese culture came naturally from his personal curiosity and passions to culture in general, and language in particular, which made him overcome the challenge of cultural shock and the difficulties of language learning in a creative and mysterious way. From the very beginning of language learning, Richard discovers Chinese language as a charming art. It is a music and painting combined together, an art which maintains his curiosities and consistent efforts to experience the mysteries of the hieroglyph language of Chinese, in contrast to alphabetic language of Latin. And finally, he grasped it skillfully. And the second part of the internal motivation and personal relation is friendship. Starting from language, Richard's journey into China was therefore a journey into the mind and heart, the culture and mindset of those Chinese he met. Within a few years of landing in China, Richard had drafted and published a book in Chinese. He's writing in Chinese, classical Chinese. The book is on friendship. So this book should make Richard becomes the founder of Western sinology. And the books on friendship was such indication of his self-identity as a typical Chinese scholar. And the next part of the international motivation and personal relations is social structure and evangelical strategy. Richard also tries to understand the Chinese social structure as well as the essence of Chinese mind. Richard wrote the books on friendship because of what China had taught him about the importance of true and influential friends to maintain his presence in this country. The concept of personal relations, 关系 in Chinese, has always been centered to any understanding of Chinese social structure. It forms an essential part of networks within Chinese communities. On the other hand, Richard's evangelical strategies of working along the high bronze line, these strategies also result from the lessons he learns from personal relations in China. Richard's early strategies at winning converts amongst the common people had ended in frustration. He fails in reaching the common people. However, the success of the books on friendship reinforces his decisions to shift from common peoples to the top-down approaches by, quote, whispers to power broker, end quote. That is, preaching to the royal elite rather than preaching to the masses. And here he was very successful. The fourth part of my presentation is lessons and applications. The Pope and most of Christian Europe of that time failed to endorse Richard's method of cultural accommodation. This was related to the historical case of Chinese rights controversy after Richard's death in 1610 at the age of 67. Richard borrows an unusual Chinese term, Lord of Heaven, 天主 in Chinese. he borrows these terms to describe the God of Abraham, despite the term's origins in traditional Chinese was worship of heaven. And he also supports Chinese traditions of he agrees with the venerations of families, ancestors, to respect for or worship the family's ancestors, even worship Confucians. This was often called the directive of maturity in history. However, the Dominicans and Franciscan, these two sects of missionaries, considers this an unacceptable accommodation, and later appeals to the Vaticans on this issue. As a result, Pope Clement in 1704 and in 1715 twice, and again Pope Benedict in 1742 reject the directive of maturity and forbade its practice. As a result, in 1721, the Kangxi emperors of Qing dynasty disagrees with Clement's decrees and bans Christian missions in China once for all. These Chinese-like controversies continues for centuries, even until now. Some contemporary Christian scholars have praised ritual as an example of beneficial enculturation, while others criticize him for distorting the gospel message. And it is also related to the compromised gospel. It's the major concerns of today's missionary theology. This is a lesson we should learn from history. And another lesson we should learn is in philosophical or theological aspect. The focus of criticisms on rituals, methods of apologies, and understanding of Confucianism. Confucianism infused with Buddhism and Taoism evolved into Neo Confucianism in the late Ming period, which Nietzsche denied, while he insisted on pure and pretense Confucianism in his Jesus China's vision. And at the same time, he insisted he insisted on pure and pristine Confucianism in his vision. And then he has the slogans, quote, "Jot close to Confucianism," and then repudiate Buddhism, end quote. This results in a furious reaction from Buddhism as well as a violent objection from the orthodoxy Confucianism, that is New Confucianism, at the Ming Dynasty. The major scholars of Confucianism is New Confucianism. It's not what Nietzsche insists of pure and pristine Confucianism. This is two lessons. There are two lessons. And finally, is my ministries in contemporary contact. I have learned from the historical lessons as mentioned above, and I also try to apply rituals methods of indirect preachings and direct preachings in my personal ministry. I'm serving Calgary Chinese Pentecost Church and a Chinese Christian Mission of Canada in Chinatowns of downtown Calgary. Chinatown is a smaller community with the typical features of traditional Chinese culture. with Chinese new immigrants, international students, and visiting scholars visit all states in Chinatown. The Christian organization in Chinatown face the challenge of cultural accommodation similar to that of rituals in Ming or Qing dynasties. I would like to embrace rituals in direct preaching as a gentle and meek way to avoid the conflicts between Western and Chinese culture. Most of Chinatown's residents, especially those with the backgrounds of visiting scholars from mainland China, consider themselves to be elite and thus hold an interest in an appreciation for Christianity. Therefore, when I approach these groups of people, I would like to be very careful and very treat them with respect and dignity. The purpose of my preaching is to establish a peaceful dialogue or conversation between two different cultures, so that they may continue their interest and explore more or deeper about Christianity. The hidden agenda is that China should be more open to the outside world, especially to the West, in order to overcome the difficulties or crises of her modernization and involvement in the global civilization. To following the indirect preaching of ritual, and that's on personal request, it is not necessary to talk about the belief proposed to Christianity in order to avoid potential conflict. It is enough for us to know that a Christian with a background of a visiting scholar, an international student, or a new immigrant similar to them. While I understand and I love and I appreciate Chinese culture as myself,